Hello, and welcome to the second section of Volume 1 for our video series. In this section, we will be focusing on managing persistent data. This is a fancy term for storing information inside of a database. We will first learn how to configure our database and get it set up inside of Laravel. We will also learn about migrations and how to set up the database tables to be organized. After that, we will move on to build our first models, finally completing our MVC paradigm. This allows us to retrieve data from the database through our models. Then we will learn Eloquent, an easy way to get and manipulate data from our database, which is unique to Laravel. Then we will learn a few advanced techniques to integrate pagination into our app so we can selectively pull data from the database. And finally, we will set up some relationships to connect multiple database tables and models together. This is the first video of this section where we will learn how to configure our database. In this video, we will learn to configure a database inside of Laravel so that Laravel can communicate with it. We will also learn about the .env file and what it does and why it's important. Now, before we continue, I want to make sure that you have installed MySQL onto your local computer already and that you have access to a username and password for your database. It will be necessary in order to complete this video that you know the username and password for your MySQL install. Without it, you cannot connect to your database or connect your database to Laravel. Now, by default, the username is root and the password is nothing, but this can vary depending on whether you've installed MySQL or how you've installed it or if you've changed it. Now, before we can start with this project, before we can connect Laravel to our database, we need to actually have a database created that Laravel can connect to. So this isn't just talking about having a MySQL install. We actually need to make sure we've got an empty database that Laravel can use. Now, don't worry about the tables and the columns and stuff like that. We're going to talk about that in the next video. That's going to be focused around migrations, and that's how we're going to set up all of the tables and columns. But we're just talking about an empty database. Now, you can use the command line to do this. You can use any graphical user interface that you have, but you just need to have a way to set up a brand new database. For me, I'm going to use a program called SQL Pro. Now, SQL Pro is a GUI interface for MySQL, and what we're going to do here is just connect to the actual MySQL install and then create an empty database. So as you can see here, the host that I'm connecting to is 127.0.0.1. The URL for localhost, this means I'm connecting locally. I'm not connecting to an external database. Now, the username that I'm using is root, and I have no password set up because this is a local install on my computer. So you're going to need to connect however you would, and this is why you need to know this information, and it's going to be different for every person's specific install. So go ahead and connect to your database. I'm going to go ahead and connect here. Okay, now inside of MySQL here, we need to create a new database. Inside of SQL Pro, the way we do that is we can come up here to this column and we can click Add Database. This is going to create an empty database. Here we give the database a name. I'm going to call this Laravel Answers because that is the name of our project. So that's the name of the database that we're going to create. Then we want to give it an encoding. Now, you can give it different encodings depending on where you live in the world and what encoding is most common. But by default, Laravel tends to use UTF-8 MB4. So I'm going to go ahead and use that here. So we're using UTF MB4, and the collation is going to be this default for this encoding. So we're going to go ahead and click Add and create that database type. Okay, we don't need to worry about tables and columns. Like I said, that's what we're going to do in the next video using a technique called migrations. So now I have a new database. It's an empty database called Laravel Answers, and that's really all I need. And now I can go ahead and connect this database to Laravel. So we can go ahead and close this program and get into our project file here. Okay, so now I'm inside of my text editor. Now let's connect that database we just connected. Let's connect that into Laravel. We do that inside of config and then database.php. Now this is all the database connection information that we need for our database. So what we're going to do here is you can see that by default, the default connection that Laravel looks for is set right here. So it's kind of funny because we have this function, env function, and it says env, and then the first parameter is called database connection, DB connection. The second parameter is MySQL. Now what we're seeing here is the beginning of our .env. So .env is a system that allows us to more securely store private information So it is unique to the environment that we're running in, and it doesn't get saved usually in our version control. So if you're using something like Git and you're storing something on GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab or some sort of private, Git install that your company uses, you may not want to store private information like how to connect to a database, the username and passwords, API keys. You may not just want to have that hard-coded into your project. There's multiple reasons why you don't want it hard-coded. The first is, of course, it changes depending on the environment that it's in. If you've got developers working locally, they're going to have different username and passwords to connect to something like, say, a database than when it's on the production server, which is going to have other usernames and passwords. So you don't want to hard code that necessarily because that information is unique depending on the environment that it's in. The other reason is security. You obviously don't want to store your usernames and passwords hard coded into your source code. So the way we get around this is using .env files. So you can see here that we've got this function called env, and what this does is there's two parameters. The first parameter is the variable that we want to access. In this case, we want to get the value for DB connection. The second parameter here is the default if there is no value found under DB connection. So by default, this function basically outputs the one string. It's either going to output the value in our env file of DB connection, or if there's nothing there or it's blank, it's going to output this default, which is MySQL. So it's going out and looking in a file, a hidden file called env. And of course, the reason it's called .env is because it has a period at the beginning because it's a hidden file. So if you look in the base of our project here, we have a file that meets that description. It's .env. Now, if we go ahead and open that up, I'm going to go and open it in a new tab here. Inside of here, you can see we've got a whole bunch of values set after these equal signs. So up here in all caps, we have the value or the constant that we're setting, and then the value to that constant is set after the equal sign. Now, by default, everything in an env file is a string, so we don't need to put quotes around it, but you can see here the app name is called Laravel. The app env, which is environment, is local, and so forth. We've set an app key. This is a security key, and it's set to this value here. So we have lots of information. You can scroll down and take a look at all these, and you can see how a lot of these are usernames, passwords, and API keys. Now, if we come up here, we can see here's a bunch of information unique to our database connections. The first one is that one we were looking for, DB connection. You can see that DB connection is set to MySQL. Now, if we go back to database.php, we know what's going to happen here. By default, what's going to happen is this function is going to go into that env file, look for the DB connection value, which we know is MySQL, and it's going to output it here. So the default connection that we're using is MySQL. That also happens to be the default that Laravel has hard-coded in case this gets deleted or we went ahead and removed this value here, then all of a sudden this function is going to fall back on the default, which is MySQL. We know that the value for this is going to be MySQL. Now, where do we see these connections? Well, all we do is we scroll down. You can see here's all the connections, and we have various connections set up here. So what we're doing is we're connecting using this block right here, MySQL. Now, the driver we're using is MySQL. That's the database type we're using, and that's how the driver we're using to connect with. And there's a few other pieces of information here. So we need to know the host. So we get that value again from our env file. The env file, we look inside of DB host, and we're going to output that here. We're then going to connect to the port, once again from the env file under DB port. Then we have our database name, the database username, and the database password, all of which are coming from the env files. So if we go back to our env files, we can actually set up this information, and all of this information will be used to connect to our database. So let's go over to the env file. You can see we already have a DB host. It's set by default to 127.0.0.1, which is the local host, which is what we need. You can see because I just connected to the database and I use this same information. The port is 3306. If you don't know the port for MySQL, it's probably 3306. That's the default. So unless you've had to change it for some reason, it's going to probably be 3306. Now we need to put the database name. Okay, now the database name is not Homestead. So this is where we got to change it. So we're going to give it the name that we just barely set up, Laravel Answers. So you remember we just barely set this up when we created the database. So now we're telling it to connect to that database. Now, in order to connect, we also need a username and we need the password. So we know the username is root for my install, but you're going to want to put whatever your username is. And then my install, the password is blank. So we're going to go ahead and just leave it blank. So there we go. That's all it takes to connect to our database. So let's go ahead and save this env file and then go back over here. And you can see that it's going to pull all of this information from that env file. So one last thing we want to talk about with env files, remember that you have your .env file here. You also have a .env.example. Now the .env.example is used, it's not actually used by Laravel, but this is a file that's actually kept in our version control. So what this does is this allows us to basically make sure that we have all the variables and constants inside of here, so that if we push this to say a production server, or if someone's pulling this from because they're sharing our project, they're cloning it from GitHub or something, this will basically give them a template for them to create their own env file. Of course, they're going to need to go through, rename it to .env without the .example at the end. So it's just .env, and they're going to need to change all the information to their settings for whatever they're using it for. But this .env.example is basically like a template file that users can use to create their own .env file. So when we're working in our .env file, if we end up making changes such as, say, a Google API key or something, and we set a Google API key here, we're going to want to go through and make sure we keep that in sync here inside the template, so that when someone goes to use our project, they know that they need to put their Google API key here. So that's the purpose of the .env.example. Now keep in mind, you can actually create any information you want inside of this .env file, but it should generally be information that's unique to your environment or information that needs to be kept private. All your usernames and passwords would be stored inside of here instead of hard-coded inside of your project. You'd also put any environment information. So, for example, you can see here that for broadcast driver, we have a log. We're using the log driver. For the cache, we're using the file driver. For session, we're using the file driver, and so forth. But when we push to production, we would probably be using something like Redis or something different. We'll be using a different driver and not the log and file drivers. And so on our production server, we would have different drivers set here, but locally we would have these drivers. So this means that the same source code that we've got here can work across different environments, whether I'm using it locally or I'm using it on the production server. And that's some of the value that .env provides. Okay, so we're going to be using .env a lot going forward, and you can see here that we configured our database mostly inside of our .env file. Now, if you look inside of your gitignore file, you'll notice that .env is not inside of your gitignore file, or is inside of your gitignore file, so it will not be stored inside when you push to version control. However, this .env.example is not inside of here, so that means it will be pushed to our project repo. So that's why we want to keep this template in place, but we don't want to necessarily put the private information in there. We keep the private information in our .env file that's unique to us, and then that way no one can see it.